OSHA inspectors of Reddit, what was the craziest thing you found during an inspection? I was the UK equivalent, Health and Safety Executive Inspector. I was inspecting an oil and gas production facility owned by one of the super majors. In one of the pump rooms, there was an eye wash station. On top of the eye wash station, someone had left a bottle of acid. It still makes me laugh, as no one was hurt. Imagining a scenario like that from a third-rate comedy movie where some poor soul got something in their eye, stumbles blindly to the eye wash station, and proceeds to squeeze a load of acid into their face. Commenter: At my previous job, I went to retrieve some parasitic acid from our chemical area, and as I was pumping, I noticed the pump had a loose piece and was leaking. So I snapped the piece back in place. It shot out all over my face. I was wearing safety glasses, however. Some of it rolled down my face behind the glasses and got into my eye. I rushed to the eye washing station, which was poorly placed next to a caustic drum. I realized the station was completely covered in caustic, and I didn't feel safe using it. Had to run across the brewery to a hand-washing sink to wash out my eye. Crap was no fun. Worst eye pain I've ever felt. That place didn't take workplace safety seriously. Glad I'm no longer there. Story 2. Non-American OSHA. You people know that meme about the forklift carrying its younglings so they can reach the top of the shelf? Exactly that. But IRL with a 6-ton and a 1.5-ton forklift in a building with 1T/M2 floor carrying capacity and about 1 ton of flammable crap as cargo. I'm no longer a safety inspector to keep my own health and sanity. Another story. Guys working in a 25-foot deep trench with oil contamination all around them with no ventilation and shoring that didn't reach the top of grade. Added, you joke, but I was a project manager for an industrial demolition company, and on my final day, I was in a building where part of it collapsed, prematurely. I was only a couple of meters away from certain death. I now work in safety. Story 3. A man crushed under a piece of marble. He was already meeting his maker, and his mortal remains are seared into my memory. The owner hadn't checked on him in a few days, and he probably had been conscious for a while, evidenced by the lack of nails, the scratch marks in the dirt on the block, and the lack of gas in the forklift. My first successful prosecution, Gomi. Story 4. I work in underground mining in Western Australia. Some of the crap I have seen is unreal. My favorite is a guy stripping off his hard hat, overalls, gumboots, and safety glasses to jump into a 1,000L barrel full of the saltiest water known to mankind to cool himself down. This was a severely overweight guy as well. I'm confident he no longer has a job in mining after the incident. Commenter: A mate of mine worked at a mine where workers were routinely tested for lead. He told me a story of a couple of guys whose lead levels were off the charts. Turns out one had made a hole in his mask that he could smoke a cigarette through, and the other was a compo kid licking handrails trying to give himself lead poisoning. Story 5. Not an inspector, but I work in the food industry. And there are these big packaging robots in our factory. These things have gates that close of every part of the machine so that no one can access anything while it's active, and it shuts down as soon as a gate is opened. Well, here's the thing. It takes a while to reboot the machine when it shuts down, and the operators don't like that. So, in some MacGyver way, they manage to rig the sensor and not noticing that the door is opened if they need to fix something or get some cardboard unstuck. Last year, a guy climbed into that machine to fix something, and while he thought he was safe, asked the new guy to press the start button on the machine to test if the fix had worked. The machine, however, didn't shut down because the gate had opened and just immediately restarted. The guy inside only had his ribs crushed because the new guy luckily had the reaction speed to press the emergency shutdown button in time. Safe to say we've been in safety meetings and giving safety training for over a year now. Story 6. I worked with a guy who wanted to collect our lockout tag-out keys for safety. Not so exciting, but bizarre and kind of scary. For those who don't know, every contractor on site has a key to lock machinery that need maintenance out of their functions. So, in theory, the machine doesn't function until the locks from every worker are personally removed when work is finished, and everyone is a safe distance away. These things would have smeared my macerated body all over the place. I trust the locks a little more in my own hands. Story 7. Not OSHA inspector, but I was visiting a new oil and gas site in Russia to resolve some issues with equipment our company had supplied. My contact was responsible for that whole area of the site, so I used to accompany him on walks round in the morning to check on the status of things. One morning, we rounded a corner to be confronted by a paint team working on the side of a large square metal structure. Large, like 4 or 5 stories high. The paint team, like a lot of the other assembly crews, were predominantly from Asia, where health and safety is rather more lax than it should be. Their painting method consisted of a guy on a TE with a bucket of paint and a roller, being lowered of the side of the building on a rope and moving from side to side applying the paint with his roller, while his mates held on to the other end of the rope. My contact screamed at them to stop, and I witnessed a massive dressing down of the entire paint team. Fully justified, as he would have been within his rights to have the entire team fired on the spot, he explained that this technique was not acceptable, and the proper way to paint the building was to contact the scaffold team and have them erect scaffold and then paint the wall while wearing harnesses, etc., etc. The team lead nodded and said he understood, stood his team down, and we continued our walk around the site. The next day, we were doing the same walk and approached the same structure, expecting to see that the scaffold team had started work, as it would take a couple of days to erect the scaffold before the painting could be started. The whole building was finished, immaculately painted, and no sign of the team or evidence of scaffold being there. We tracked down the team lead, who swore on his mother's life that the scaffold had been erected, the painting done, and the scaffold removed within the space of about 23 hours. It transpired that this was the last job the team had to complete before their contract finished. So no doubt they were keen to get paid and begin the long journey home, and no further action was taken. But looking at the dried paint in the sunlight a few days later, you could clearly see roller marks in a gently arc over the entire surface. Story 8. Not an inspector, but was working on a job where some ceiling installer was on a scissor lift. Bunch of guys underneath him, some working with water. Guy had a spotter who wasn't paying attention. As the lift operator was raising the platform, it caught onto a spider box cable, large electrical line, and was about to pull way too much tension. I ran over and yelled to get the operator's attention, then was forced to hit the E-shut-off switch on the ground. He yelled at me. The spotter yelled at me. Everyone looked at me, wondering what I was doing. I pointed at the cable and asked him what he thought of it. Operator saw the cable and turned white as a ghost as he realized he almost cooked himself and others. Bonus. I watched from the 5th floor as some gate installers almost killed themselves. They were installed a huge side slider gate to a concrete wall. Gate popped loose and hit the ground, then fell over and nearly missed a guy by literal inches. The guy body slammed a porta potty to get out of the way. Commenter reminds me of my one morning at work. I showed up to unlock, get the register and all that fun stuff ready. Go to unlock the gate and see someone unlocked it. Great. Give it a tug, and the entire gate, easily a few hundred pounds at least, was like a 8 feet or so iron gate, just falls towards me. Luckily dodged it, but yelled at the guy who decided to remove the pins and leave it that way with no warning or sign. Story 9. Not an OSHA inspector, but related, and I regularly do inspections together with them. One of the factories that a related but not quite subsidiary company runs received a formal complaint which triggered an OSHA inspection. The complaint mentioned something along the lines of machines not being properly barricaded, resulting in someone losing 2 fingers and could result in a big lawsuit. My company wasn't happy, as although they weren't in the direct line of fire, there was reputational damage involved. We got there. Foreman pointed us to the machine. We got them to break it open to see the damage. Out pops not 2, but 6 little blobs. 2 of them were definitely fingers, bloody gristly and all that jazz. In my mind, I was going, great, incident verified. The dimwit running the place was going to get slapped with a stupid fine. Time to wrap up and go home. Then the inspector started poking at the other 4 shriveled gray blobs. Because those were rats, right? Dead rats? But why don't they have any skulls? He poked one of them until it crumbled open, and voila, those weren't rats. Those were desiccated damn fingers. There are 6 damn fingers in one machine. After the 2 of us spent some time hurling chunks in a pot nearby, we got to hear some even better news. This machine with the crafty safety crap and 6 fingers in it, there were 7 more machines just like that one in the factory. And the foreman admitted that the factory owner has been firing all the foreign workers operating the machine if anyone ever spoke about past incidents and suppressing all the incidents until someone finally had enough and reported him. It was at that point where this stopped being an inspection and turned into a full-blown criminal investigation, and my company dropped the factory like a hot potato. But not before we sued the pants off the sick sob, naturally. Last I heard, they had found close to 40 fingers and an actual damn arm in the other machines, and the dude was facing life in prison. My country is pretty crap about workers' rights, especially foreign workers, so I was honestly quite surprised they even managed to drag him to court in the first place. Story 10. Not OSHA, but UK equivalent surveying pressure equipment under PSSR and HSE. This was at an older factory that we'd just taken the insurance contract over. The stupidest thing I've seen was on a steam boiler that had recently had the burner swapped out for a newer model. Said newer model hadn't been set up correctly in relation to the operating pressure and kept lifting the safety valves. The boiler was rated to 14 barg, operated at around 10.5 barg, and the valves lifted around 11 barg. Any normal engineer would think to tune the burner properly or get the original unit refitted. What they decided to do, in their infinite wisdom, was to blank off the safety valve outlets, meaning they couldn't discharge to atmosphere. Effectively, they had created a massive bomb. I only found it after seeing it go through a burn cycle and watching the pressure shoot past the safety valve opening pressure and hit, even after the burner had stopped firing, without hearing the thunder and racketing of the safeties lifting. That was a fun phone call to our technical superintendent, and one of the longer reports I'd written, though not the longest. Story 11. Not OSHA inspector, but was something similar. Rooftop flooded for leak test, in sections. Mostly dry, one wet area. Guy took off his boots and socks and walked across 2 inches of murky water filled with nails, screws, jagged shards of cut sheet metal, and so on. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was a little off. On a similar note, I was shocked by a 220 volts cable submerged in water in a similar situation. I was wearing boots. Shocked, but was insulated enough that there was no damage. Regular commercial job sites are extremely dangerous. Everyone I know who does anything interesting has been dinged up severely, and I've witnessed people falling from ladders, drunk at work, stoned at work, drunk and stoned. People having heat strokes, fainting, breaking their legs and hands, saw a lift, temporary elevator drop out of control, rocks and pavers fall from a crane. More than once saw someone almost get crushed between a swinging crane load of over a ton. Twice, there was a major gas line break so big that it would have destroyed more than a city block if it had been ignited. The second gas line was high capacity and was hissing loudly, even from a distance. Everyone was yelling, "No fuego! No fuego!" I've never seen people run down stairs so quickly. It felt like the building was going up. One time an actual OSHA guy showed up to the job site. Never seems to happen. And his only complaint, despite all the obvious hazards, was that people having unlabeled water bottles might result in contamination. Story 12. A not OSHA cause not USA, but internal company safety inspector. Guy broke a few bones after doing unsafe stuff without proper equipment. Guy and his buddies knew the guy would get treated at the plant, but would get a written warning for not following protocol. Enough of those result in termination. So they hid the guy in a shipping container until end of shift, something like 3 hours, and carried him to the free hospital afterwards. Story 13. Not an OSHA inspector, but as an electrician in the elevator industry, one of our supervisors walked into a 7 or 8-story lift shaft to find one worker in a makeshift harness made by combining and tying slings together being lifted up the shaft by a coworker using an electric winch hanging on the top of the shaft. They were both Chinese nationals the boss had brought over to work and were actually very good lefties, but had absolutely no concept of safety and clearly no regard for their own lives. Story 14. It was actually before I moved into health and safety, not American. I worked for an industrial demolition company, and I witnessed 2 premature collapses where people in the vicinity almost died, and 2 failed collapses, which are arguably scarier because people have to go back into an already weakened structure. We're talking like 10,000 tons of steel coming down unexpectedly, and only missing people by a few meters. I, unfortunately, was one of those people on one occasion. It was my final day in the industry. Story 15. I'm not an OSHA inspector, but if my workplace had an inspection, it would go down badly. Guy working a large drill press at a high feed with barely enough emulsion and no ventilation in a 4x4 M box. Those fumes fry her lungs and brain. India-styled cable management hanging atop and from a single pole hanger crane with a max lifting load of 1T, lifting 3T while bending about 10%. Rod polishing on lathes with hands in gloves and long sleeve hoodies. Hydraulic oil everywhere. Usually collected, if not spilled in large barrels, then burned during winter in a shady oil furnace that catches fire once a week. Chemicals in used water bottles with no labeling all around the place. Everything that you touch zaps you most of the time, especially tap water while washing hands. We once took a tester and turned out everything in that place. Even the hanger itself had 35 volts running through at all times. Every single thing. Even the tap water. Tens of unreported accidents a year. There was an employee who blew himself up a few years back. He was doing pyrotechnics and smoked next to a powder mill. Explosives squad was called in and they found 200 kilograms of explosives in his closet at work. Story 16? I'll share late because I have a good one. I used to work in a factory that was insanely breaking the rules to speed up the process of making the materials they sell. Here's a couple. 1. Acid line running through the inside of the building from source to vats dripped in a doorway when running. 2. A catwalk above gigantic vats of hot nitric acid with no railing that workers went on to dump reagents into the vats. Better just wear your respirator. They never did. 3. The chemical procedure causes a NOx gas to spew out. And if something goes wrong, the entire building can fill with this hazardous gas, and you can even see it in the office area spewing across the ceiling. A thick orange-red cloud. No one except me ever left the building. Someone was fired for smoking on the job. Almost half of them did. And they notified OSHA of all the violations they could think of. OSHA came in and left without talking to anyone except the higher-up office staff. A couple days later, we had to sign a change agreement to be up to code. The sheet literally had 8 things written on it with a title at the top and crew name signature lists at the bottom. None of it included the most dangerous issues, and that was the last I heard of any of it. I left that job shortly after. Story 17. I was inspecting a salad bar and saw rat crap at the bottom. I then went to the back room and saw something horrific. A guy sitting at his desk, doing payroll nude. As I leaned in to tell him about the rat crap salad toppings, I almost had a heart attack at the sight before my virgin eyes that no human should ever witness. In the background, I noticed he was not seeding his torrents. Story 18. I worked at an onion warehouse place in 2017. A guy came method out to work. Everyone knew he'd do it often, but no one said anything because he still did his job. That's until we were all at lunch and came back him running literally on the onion belt on full speed like a treadmill and just running without a care as if he was working out at home. We slowed it down, turned it off, and fired his ass. Then we had to sanitize the whole belt for hours. By we, I mean my sister and I, because the sanitation crew was apparently also high. Story 19. For context, I worked as a white hat OSHA consultant through a state government grant for just under 5 years. Went to the same training school outside Chicago as the federal OSHA enforcement agents, but didn't have the power to fine. I mostly worked with small to medium businesses across my state, since they could request a consultation for free, the price being a legal agreement to fix what we found. 3 of the most puckering incidents that come to mind. Forklift driver stops forklift and gets out to gawk at workers pouring molten steel into a ceramic crucible. Forklift is idling in park, engine running, forks elevated with a load. Driver is not trained, geared up to be near molten metal. Sparks and droplets from the molten metal are bouncing off the side of the forklift body, with sparks sometimes arcing towards the propane canister and the fuel hose. One lucky glob of molten steel and you get at least a flash fire and at worst a bomb. Workers throwing, as in hurling, aluminum ingots into an electric melt furnace in jeans and t-shirts instead of the specially coated molten metal splash protective clothing, and instead of using tongs and gently dropping the ingots into the molten metal pool to prevent splashes. Third-degree burns caused by molten aluminum splashes that sticks to the skin. Workers in a 3-sided garage for fluidized bed powder coating of paint particles before it's baked on in an oven. The paint flakes are combustible. The special sealed covers on the fluorescent lights overhead, the ones rated for combustible dust, had been removed, revealing exposed high-voltage contacts. An ace-plugged radio with a frayed cord was dragged into the powder coating chamber, and employees would mess with their cell phones in the booth area. It was gambling to see what ignition source would lead to a combustible dust fuel air bomb. Bonus, a solvent manufacturing company. Most of their regular fare products were stored in giant metal tanks, though they also made smaller batches of items to order. Due to a separate EPA environmental regulation, they had calculated the worst-case scenario for a tank of propane in a side building that would be used to make their aerosol spray bottles for their smallest batches of chemicals. Except that the overall OSHA regulations had a similar worst-case scenario estimation requirement for their overall chemical process safety program. I noted that a similar study would need to be done for the main portion of the plant, and they argued about it. So I did a bit of not legally binding back-of-the-envelope chemical math using my university thermodynamics textbooks and the company's own data sheets about their chemicals, and found that their math on the propane tank exploding was correct. In it, everyone with about 60 m was going to have their last day. But should a fire and a blev occur across their main storage tank farm, using the data they had on hand for which chemicals and how much, and even doing a low-yield estimate, everyone within 300 m was likely dead, and the overpressure would cause serious injury to people and break every glass window, out to about 1.3 kilometers. That 300 m sphere also including a secondary motorway. Story 20. Oh, my time to shine. I was working on ship construction in Norway. My task was to build platforms inside the chimney chute. Think big shaft from the engine room all the way up to the top of the bridge, so the exhaust pipes could be run through it too to bottom. So I do ladder, platform, grating, ladder, and so on from bottom to top. So while this was going on, the whole upper structure wasn't attached to the ship itself yet, but sitting on a separate floating platform so a crane could hoist it on there when ready. One day I'm working in there about 3 stories up, cutting plastic grating with my angle grinder, ear guards, mask, visor, helmet on. By sheer dumb luck, I noticed some guy talking to me from the door at the bottom, then ducking back out. I turn my angle grinder off, take my ear guards and visor off to ask him what's up. The guy doesn't come back, so I go down, step through the door, and nearly into the sea. It turns out he was charged with clearing the housing so it could be lifted onto the ship, but I guess he didn't consider it enough of his job to wait for me to make sure I actually got that message. So by the time it took me to get my gear off and come down, they had simply started the lift. Luckily, I had to stand there in full view of about 500 dudes while they finished the lift, including management, so I'm sure the safety guy had to answer some questions later on. Skip forward about 3 months. The boat is getting its finishing touches. In this period, it's common for them to test the engines by running them in short bursts. The ship faces the docks and gets pushed up against this massive rubber bumper so that when the engines go, it'll just press into that. Now, this was a supply boat for oil rigs, which means it has a giant steel cable winch on the back, which is used to bring stuff up to the rigs from the boat. This particular day was the day where to cable was being cooled onto the winch, so the ship was facing out toward the fjord, sunny day. So who decided to eat lunch outside? So as my ass sat there on the dock, I had a front row seat to the ship revving its engines, getting enough momentum to start drifting out, pulling the winch, cable, and truck, holding it into the water. That's about 10 mil worth of equipment. Suffice to say, it took me a moment to process what I just saw, but I'll never forget the look on the supervisor's face when he ran out and saw the carnage. Priceless. Story 21. Not as an OSHA inspector, but I'll share my story. At the time, I was working for a testing laboratory that tested products for safety in potentially explosive atmospheres where flammable gas mixtures might be present. This customer was relatively new and a bit over their head, so they had a number of nonconformances, which required repeat testing. The proper way to test products like this is to build a representative circuit and run the two ends of that circuit into a small chamber that is filled with an explosive gas mixture. There are rotating discs inside the chamber with small filaments that simulate the opening and closing of a switch over and over again. If the circuit has enough energy, you get an explosion that is vented outside. This one customer was attempting to replicate the failure I advised them of and then work on a solution. The customer called me and said he couldn't replicate the failure. I asked him how he was testing it, and he said his other engineer was out in the parking lot and had a large trash bag with the product inside of the bag, and they were pumping hydrogen inside the bag while the engineer was reaching into the bag, activating the stitches. I told my customer to immediately go outside and tell his engineer to stop, as he had created a hydrogen bomb that could explode. He protested a bit, not believing me, and wanted me to explain why what he was doing was dangerous. Story 22. I was walking through the shop one day when I saw a guy in civilian clothes holding a microphone over my buddy's shoulder. I took a closer look and saw that my buddy was cycling a lug nut off and on with a 3/4 inches impact. The guy told me he was with occupational sanitation or something like that, and I asked him, "Are you just trying to get a baseline for an impact gun?" "No, I'm just trying to record the loudest thing in the shop." My buddy stopped, looked at the guy, and said, "You just said you wanted the largest impact. You didn't say anything about the loudest tool in the shop." The guy's eyes went a little wide when he asked, "You've got something louder?" My buddy and I looked at each other, and at the same time we said, "Cheetah?" "Cheetah." We told him why we'd use it, setting beads on tires of all sizes, how we were taught to use it, charge the 8-gallon air tank until it stopped charging, which would be the system pressure for the compressor, and then we demonstrated on a spare tire by dumping a butterfly valve and releasing all that air through a flat oval fitting about 3 inches by half an inch wide. It put out just over 140 decibels. "Holy crap," the guy said, before even looking at the reading. "So you guys normally use double hearing protection with that?" Well, the guy using it kind of does some hearing protection. Everybody else just kind of flinches and keeps working. The guy's eyes got really concerned for a minute before he asked, "What does the guy using it do?" I recharged the tank and demonstrated again. "See? I'm jamming this thing against the rim with my belly, and then I'm using my right index finger to plug my right ear, and I jam my left ear into my shoulder so I can use my left hand to dump the butterfly valve." The guy was speechless. He eventually asked if there was anything else that we could use, but with the tires we were setting, there really wasn't. By the way, I've got pretty gnarly tinnitus and hearing loss now. There was no formal training for the Cheetah. We all learned how to use it from some other guy, who learned from some other guy, and so on. Yes, the gauge said we were overcharging the tank by way too much, but sticking to the green part of the gauge wasn't enough pressure for the size of tires we were always working with. Story 23. I'm not an OSHA inspector, but I am a lawyer that works for a very large company. We had a department team building playing laser tag on company premises, and 4 separate attorneys ended up tripping over decor that had been put up and spraining their ankles. A week later, the company president came to meet with the general counsel and saw a bunch of attorneys with matching boots on and freaked out. Story 24. Not OSHA, but I worked in the printing industry, and the thing that gave me anxiety every time was our paper delivery. We'd order a pallet of a 480-gram paper, 80 boxes in total at a weight of 1,000 kilogram, 22.05 pounds, 1 ton. The pallet had to be moved by a hydraulic paper trolley. The truck itself had a tail lift, but we didn't have a proper loading bay, so they had to lower it onto the floor. The problem is, the tail lift wasn't big enough for the trolley, which would slightly hang over the edge of the lift, leaving no space for the operator to safely ride the lift down. What they had to do was load the pallet onto the paper trolley as normal inside the truck and then pull it out onto the tail lift. But because the trolley wouldn't fit on the tail lift with the operator had to jump off the lift, but timing it in such a way that he'd activate the locking mechanism of the hydraulic trolley so it wouldn't follow him off the tail lift. I also need to add that the weight of this would make the tail lift slope toward the ground. When standing on the ground, the tail lift was just below head height, so the trolley operator was in a situation where the slightest miscalculation would send 1 ton of paper plus momentum plus gravity crashing onto him. My heart rate would accelerate every time I watched this. Story 25. Summer student 1984, Mississauga stamping plant, electric arc welders. My partner inserted the part into the welder, added 3 metal plates, pushed 2 buttons, and zap 8 electrodes, welded the pieces together. Repeat, 1,000 parts per day. The problem was that the plumbing hoses providing water to cool the electrodes were leaking everywhere. Water was running all over the welder. My partner Nick was standing in a puddle of water 2 inches deep, on a concrete floor operating an electric arc welder. Sparks were flying everywhere. I repeatedly tried to get Nick to stop working and contact the supervisor. I told him that when he got electrocuted, I would refuse to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Finally, he stopped work and contacted maintenance. Story 26? Lab inspector here. The process was, I walk around the labs, then shoot a picture of the no most egregious violations, so my boss in the office could send off nagging emails and or do write-ups. I walk into a geology lab and see that they're using a random lidless container as a waste receptacle. It's outside of the fume hood, but at least has a label on it. Not the worst I saw that day, I think. I send a picture to my boss. Then I pick it up and move it into the fume hood, into the drip tray. It sloshes but doesn't spill. My boss calls me. He called me all of twice during 4 years working together. So, I'm confused. Do not touch that container. Did you already touch it? Okay, don't touch it again. Get a piece of paper and write lab closed, call, and my extension ASAP. Do not go back in there. That container's contents mixed together to make hydrofluoric acid. For anyone who doesn't know, that crap likes calcium. I was wearing full PPE, but my boss was scared because that stuff will eat down to your bones and only stop once it reaches calcium. In large enough amounts, it eats your bones too. Approved labs had a long process to get that stuff, and when it was on campus, I had to call all of the immediate heirs to make sure they had an antidote on hand. But this dumb lab was making it via improperly handled waste products in a damn takeout container. Not to mention that lab treated PPA like it was contaminated with the plague, so we just got incredibly lucky no one had to go to the hospital. Their lab wasn't allowed to do any additional chem as part of their curriculum for the rest of the semester until the professor did additional safety trainings. Story 27, not my story. And my friend whose story this is didn't work for OSHA, but was a representative of a construction materials company that was considering selling the product of the plant where this story took place. He shows up and the plant manager starts the tour. The sign that many workplaces have that says, "It has been few days since our last accident," said 34. Not a good start. About halfway through the tour, my friend hears any extremely loud noise that he said sounded like an explosion. He didn't see what happened, so couldn't confirm that that's what it was, but it was followed by several men screaming. The plant manager also obviously heard it and hurried the tour along as quickly as he could away from the sound. They get to the area where the product the plant makes was shaped using spinning blades. I can't remember what it's called, but it is identical to a tool that rounds the edges of wood, but obviously much larger and meant for heavier industry. Downrange from this machine was an extremely rickety fence that was clearly pieced together by people at the plant in a hurried and sloppy fashion. My friend was walking with this fence on his left and the machine on the other side of the fence. To his right, there was a wall that had dozens of impact craters from blades breaking off of the machine and striking the wall at very high speed. The fence was put up as a barrier to prevent people walking by from getting hit by these pieces of shrapnel. He said this fence was so shoddily built, it wouldn't have stopped a stiff breeze. As the tour is wrapping up, he sees that someone is erasing the 34 days from the workplace accident sign. He never did find out what the noise was. I asked him what he told his work about the tour. He said, "I told them what I saw." Story 28. Does food standards count? Because you have all the general mankiness, infestations, and whopping hygiene breaches. But the ones that really stick out to me in the year and a half I was tangentially involved were the ones where they just carried on as if nothing was wrong for something that normal folks just stared open-mouthed at. 2 ones I particularly recall. 1, a mince mixing machine that had black machine oil dripping down indirectly into the mixing bowl. 2, the shelf with bottles that went mayo, barbecue sauce, bleach, ketchup. Story 29. The worst thing I've seen on this job is someone who was digging a trench with completely unsecured shoring, about 10 feet deep, with wall width of approximately 4 feet, part of it being under concrete. Trenching is one of the #1 causes of workplace fatalities. If we get a call of trenching with no shoring, we get sent out immediately. One of 4 things that get us sent out like that. The old guy that's been in the office 15 some years looked at it, said it was the worst trenching he's ever seen, and he very often does trenching. It was to the point he was surprised it didn't collapse. That, and one time a dude actually was in a trench collapse. He was buried up to his neck, and while he was trying to be rescued, his wife Cam and told him that she was pregnant. Luckily, the dude survived. News put it as a real heartwarming moment, but the whole situation was super easily avoidable. Remember, folks, OSHA has very few inspectors. We likely won't go to a place unless we receive a complaint, but if we receive a valid formal online complaint from a current employee and they request an inspection, we're required to go out on it. Story 30. Health and safety inspector here. There are so many good stories. A septic tank made out of metal Amico signs. Metal and earth equal sign corrosion. The septic guy was jumping on the top of the signs, and they started crumbling. So he got a poop bath. Owner of a company crawling inside a 90-foot-long oven to look at grease buildup in front of the whole crew. Immediately after a safety meeting with said owner and crew discussing how this is a confined space and it cannot be safely entered without safeguard in place. Finger pie when we had an amputation. An attempt lost their ring finger, died to an irising hopper. We got to the pie before it made it to the oven. What else? Forklift undocking where the truck left with our operator and forklift still inside. Got 1/2 mile before the forklift and operator fell out the back onto the city road. Guy who got covered in hypochlorite, pH 14 stuff, all in his eyes and face and all over his body, and miraculously escaped with a 2-on-2-inch patch of discoloration instead of having his eyes melted out of his head. So many fun stories. Story 31. Not OSHA. Event production manager for a custom fab, an event production company that I'm very glad COVID put a stop to. 1. My second day at the office, a man ran in with blood pouring down his arm, saying he cut himself on the circ saw. My GM calmly stopped my onboarding and left to take him to the hospital. I later saw a series of saw blades hung in the fabrication office, and a bloody one at the end with that man's initials on it. 2. On a site on top of a mountain, I tasked 2 carpenters with unloading the truck with the items meant for the far end of the event. They decided to drive the truck off-road around the tent instead of carrying the items through. They also decided to have one carpenter hang out in the back of the truck instead of the cab to hold everything up. She was very lucky. The worst thing that happened to her from riding in the back of a 26A truck full of gear off-road was a broken big toe. 3. The owner wouldn't raise rates to be competitive or reasonable, so the only crew we could get were college kids or industry hands who were too problematic to get better work. Substances, alcohol, difficult to work with. Our lead rigger was the latter, and I had to ground him after other crew members reported that he had been out drinking all night before the job. Only returned to the hotel at 7:30 a.m. and was still toasted. That same job, our truck driver, who was a college kid on his first job, accidentally filled up the truck with diesel instead of regular and caused $40K worth of engine damage and broke down in the Rocky Mountains on the way home. Story 32. I worked as an art fabricator. A client wanted us to spray oil paint with automotive spray guns. The paint pigments are full of cadmium, cobalt, titanium, etc., and it literally said "do not spray" on the side of the paint tubes. The safety precautions? My boss gave us dust masks and stuck a fan in the window. I was in my early 20s and just thankful to be out of food service. But the client showed up and flipped out when he saw how little protection we were given. Thankfully, he made sure we all had proper respirators, Tyvek suits, and colossal automotive downdraft air cleaners. 0.3 months into the project. Anyway, be nice to your wait staff. Heavy metal poisoning was preferable to getting screamed at over a burger. Story 33. We had a volunteer, nonprofit business, with 20 years experience in building trades and another 5 as a volunteer, fire a nail gun through his hand while demonstrating to our clients how a nail gun has a mechanism to stop it from firing unless it was pressed up against something. Story 34. 2. Deep trench with no shoring, working at heights and on construction sites, wearing flip-flops, working on live electrical wires with no electric insulation, used condoms in the middle of the factory, and so on and so forth. Story 35. I had the county EPA show up to the shop one time. I asked, how come we can take oil out of the ground, but we can't pour it back on top? Not funny. It was all downhill from there. Story 36. Not an inspector, but if you have a look at basically any tree work site, I've worked for several arborist gigs and 100% of them have had something. I've seen things as simple as refusing to wear seatbelts or not quite up to code equipment, or working in very rapidly fading light, all the way to non-safety around high voltage lines, one of which caused damage, shall we say, to more than one person, luckily, no deaths. Outright refusal to wear critical safety gear, or extremely lucky, I can't believe nobody's dead instances. There are times when the entire month year is just one long OSHA violation. Granted, not all tree work companies, and I have seen safe ones. I'm just not lucky enough to have worked at one that is willing to slow down for 0.00002 seconds in the name of profits. In fact, I've been yelled at on numerous occasions to just hurry up and do X because we have 3 more jobs to do. Story 37. I started a job in a store that sold meat of all kinds. Huge amounts of the refrigerator bins fill a massive room. On my first day, the boss is explaining my duties. Each time he pauses, I say, "What is that smell?" He never responded, and eventually he's getting angry because I keep interrupting him to say, "No, seriously, what is that smell?" So I realized he's just going to ignore me. So I walk towards where I think the smell is coming from. He's following behind me, barking orders. Other employees stop to watch. I crouch next to a cold case and pull off the base. Now the boss is screaming for me to get off the ground and get out. Under each case are drip trays, about 4 inches deep, 4 feet wide, and 12 feet long. There are about 50 of these trays, each full and overflowing with mold. Over 100 feet of mold. The entire building stunk with the mold smell. The boss's face went completely blank. He'd obviously never looked under these cases before because he didn't know how to remove these massive trays. So instead of getting fired, I cleaned all the trays. They opened up all the doors, and for the first time, their work area smelled like fresh air. I was let go a week later. Story 38. A mandatory not inspector, but I've spent some time the last few months reading safety regulations. So having just familiarized with the regulations on working at heights, I see on my way home 2 guys on the roof of the building they're constructing next door, assembling a non-sufficient railing along the edge of the roof without any additional safety measures. Only half the building had a roof on at the time, and they were standing at the end of the part that had a roof. So in one direction, they had the insufficient railing they were assembling, which may or may not have stopped a fall, and in the other, they had a 7 to 8 m drop without anything to protect them, where they hadn't placed the roof yet. It wasn't a flat roof either. Some rain, and it would have been really, really dangerous. It was just interesting walking home, seeing this and thinking, I just read about this. That is definitely not allowed. Story 39, UK. I was called to a site which had a restriction on its construction management that specified no burning of any waste or materials at any time. Someone had observed a rather large amount of smoke coming from the site. It was in the middle of a heat wave, with it having been consistently over 30 degrees Celsius for several days. The site had a lot of dead and dying vegetation. I arrive and there's a chap operating a JCB demolishing an old outbuilding, likely containing asbestos, that contained a swimming pool and heating equipment. In the hole in ground of the former swimming pool was a large bonfire with a laborer chucking anything that he could get his hands on into it. The aforementioned heating equipment is central to the idiocy, as there was less than 20 feet away from this uncontrolled fire, a 3,000 L gas tank with obvious lines running from it in all directions, including towards the former outbuilding and pool. I don't think I have ever before or since given such a blocking. Immediately had all work cease and the operator of the JCB to move to the other side of the pit and had him move all the dirt and sand within reaching distance over the fire to smother it. Story 40. This one time there was a deadly pandemic that killed millions worldwide. We had refrigerated body trucks in the streets. Hospital was chronically collapse-level overwhelmed. The personal protective equipment they gave us for infection control, plastic garbage bags to wear over our scrubs. Face masks designed for 30 minutes of effective use were worn for days. 115,000 of us died. Story 41? Not really relevant to the post, but I can share an accident story. Not us. It's an industrial town, and when I say industry, I mean city-sized plants dealing in natural gas and fuel of all types and steel and defense and power plants and refining and whatnot. Streetlights in such places are highly specialized in nature, so as not to provide a spark, even in case there is a leak. Well, one day, there was a leak in one of the plants, and just one screw in one of the lights was a little loose, and it provided the spark that set off a huge blaze in a complex that had enough gas to create a mini nuclear blast, and all its neighbors were similar. Could have blown the place off the face of the earth, all caused by just one loose screw. Gets even better. Naturally, all these places have their own fire crew. They got down to work immediately. The other industries dispatched their crews as well, but they were not given permission to enter. A place on fire literally turned away fire crews. Damn. Story 42. An OSHA inspector caught an old supervisor of mine having sex with a coworker in a boiler room that did not have the proper warning signs on the door. Story 43. I'm a safety guy for a construction company. Craziest thing I saw was a guy dislocated both his shoulders while pushing a mobile scaffold. It had too much momentum, and when he tried stopping it, both arms popped out of the socket. We were talking about hundreds of pounds of steel, going a few inches further than he wanted. The funniest thing I saw was a guy walking right into a beam. Somehow, I was the only person to see him do it. Everyone else just saw him getting up off the floor after I lost my crap laughing. Story 44. Former hospital safety inspector here. We acquired a surgeon's private practice, and when I went in to inspect the first time, there were soiled instruments with blood on them in the sink of the employee break room next to the used coffee cups. Biohazard waste receptacle and autoclave in there too. No separation of clean and soiled. I'm a firm believer in doctors' offices being owned and run by hospitals because the standards are higher. Story 45. Not an inspector, but at my previous job, we'd had a bad accident in the factory. Someone died. So OSHA came through for an inspection. The bosses had taken us all and said, hey, make sure you follow all the rules to the letter and be smart about this. I was walking the factory floor when the inspector showed up. He held up his clipboard and clicked a pen and said, "Okay, let's see what we have here," and looked immediately to his left, where a guy was pouring paint thinner into a 55-gallon drum from a 5-gallon bucket while having a lit cigarette in his mouth. I knew it was going to be good when the OSHA inspector had a what-the-heck look on his face 5 seconds into the inspection. Story 46. Obligatory, not an inspector, but the person that did the thing was the inspector. Boilers for steam heat needed to be inspected. Big enough boilers to walk into the firebox to look at them. It was locked out and tagged out while the inspectors were in there with the manager looking it over. There were 2 inspectors, and one of them was new and kind of training too. After they were done and out, they took their locks and tags off when the new inspector realized he left something in the firebox and quickly ran back in to retrieve it. The door was shut behind him with no way out. The manager, inspector, and operators went to the control room to start it up and realized they were missing a person. After looking around, they decided to open the boiler firebox and found the guy sitting there, basically waiting to die. Thankfully, nothing bad happened and just turned into a huge reminder of why those safety procedures are in place, and not to go back into something when it has been unlocked and cleared. Story 47. Not OSHA, but my first assignment as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army was to be a battalion motor officer in charge of trucks, jeeps, etc., for a 3-company battalion. On my first day on the job, I showed up at the motor pool, unannounced. When the sergeant running things at that moment saw me, he yelled, "Officer in the motor pool!" and everything stopped. 20 feet suspended in the air were 2 enlisted soldiers in homemade climbing harnesses, hanging from overhead winches by hooks, jousting with push brooms. I pulled every NCO within a 10-mile radius into my new office, told them that I had not seen what I had just seen, and that if I had seen what I had just seen, they would all be receiving Article 15S. For reference, an overhead winch is a remotely operated crane that is used to lift engines from jeeps and trucks. We even had one strong enough to lift the turret off of a tank. Story 48. I'm not OSHA, but the shop I work in was being remodeled. New doors, paint. They installed a drop ceiling to help control birds. It's a very large shop. 20 doors, 2 air compressors, big shop with offices in the middle. We stayed on one side while the other was being remodeled. One day I walked over to the other side to see how things were going. I immediately said, "Nope," and turned around and went back to our side of the shop and got our manager. We have 2 pressure washers plummeted into our shop so we can clean the floors. There's a central drain in the floor running the length of the shop that goes to a storage tank. Before painting, these guys thought it would be a good idea to pressure wash the whole shop, ceiling and walls. All the power was still on, and our lights are 480 volts. 2 guys in 1 scissor lift with 2 pressure washers 25 feet in the air, washing a ceiling around lights that are on. Story 49. My so used to work for a well-known high-tech company. He worked at keeping things running for the chip makers, as they had to transport the materials from one place to another. There was an area that was very difficult to get to and required employees wearing bunny suits to climb over and under numerous barriers to get to where they needed to go. He was told that while he was in that area, he was on his own. Emergency services refused to go there at all. If someone had a heart attack, there was no emergency personnel who was going to help him. If he fell and broke his leg, he would have to drag himself over and under all the barriers to get help. I can't believe that this sort of thing is allowed to exist. Why is there a skeleton over in the corner? Is it for Halloween? No, that's just Bob. Had a heart attack years ago. At least he doesn't stink anymore. Story 50. Oh boy, I have so many stories. Window installer holding other installer's ankles while he caulked around the exterior of a window opening above the 10th floor of a building. A set of job-made stairs collapsed while I was performing an inspection. A core box fell onto a slab while being flown in by a crane. Turns out there were 3 workers in it who were too lazy to take the stairs. Dude broke his wrist and pelvis. The other 2 were miraculously somehow fine with just soft tissue skis and cuts. Superintendent electrocuted himself in front of an inspector while trying to open the access panel on a diesel light tower with the claw of a hammer. Mixer truck backed over a fire hydrant during a photo shoot for a safety organization's calendar. Workers living in the tool lockup of a high-rise, bunk beds, TV, hot plate, etc. The list goes on and on and on. Story 51. I'm not an OSHA inspector, but I work in project management, and I'm OSHA 30 certified. We had a new ironworker contractor on our site. These are some things they did. Brought their personal lunchbox to a production line through a non-personnel entrance in a factory that makes food. Working on a scissor lift wearing a harness that wasn't tied off, while doing hot work with no hand or arm protection while their visor was up. I guess it was safety quint day. Smoking right outside an open dock door on a tobacco-free property. They were informed. They were told every single day to go off property to smoke. Using a grinder to cut metal with no mitigation for metal shavings, dust, and no hand protection. Their foreman was finally told if he didn't get his people's crap together, the whole firm would be fired for cause and someone else brought in. Story 52. I worked at OSHA as an intern for a few terms. My first month there, I assisted a Kisho on a fatality where a landscaper got decapitated by an excavator bucket. We showed up, and they had the victim in the same spot where he died so we can investigate. That was the first time I saw a dead body in person. His coworkers were absolutely devastated, and I had to keep my composure the whole time to stay professional. One thing for sure is that I was not prepared for that at all, but everything else following that day was pretty much all the same, but under different circumstances. That experience gave me a much broader perspective on how people take life for granted and how crap goes from 0 to 100. Take your safety serious because people get killed for the most basic crap. Story 53. Not an OSHA inspector story, but amusing nonetheless. At my workplace, a metal shelf was being used to hold up several 20-plus car batteries that were put there because they had either cracked cases or were unchangeable. Fast forward 6 months, someone went to move one of them, and the bottom 3 shelves disintegrated, dropping all the batteries onto the concrete below. Apparently, the acid from a few had a fun time removing bits from the metal in the shelving like atomic Jenga, and it just took a slight disturbance to bring it down. After cleaning up, there was a hole in the 4 inches concrete slab underneath, where all the concrete turned into white, powdery fluff from some acid pooling there. They put packing peanuts in the hole and white duct tape over it just to keep cold air from drafting in underneath the new shelving they put in the same place. Story 54. I have a friend who worked as a crane man in a steel mill. Large coils of steel were stacked on their sides like giant rolls of toilet paper. He would stack them such that there was a pocket approximately 150 SQ feet large in the center of a group of coils. The mill was so large that the foreman would come down to inspect in a little four-wheeler. One of the guys on the floor would distract the foreman by getting him to look at a coil that had some damage on it. While the distraction was going on, my friend would pick up the four-wheeler with his crane and drop it into the pocket. The foreman then spent the rest of the day looking for his four-wheeler. Story 55. We once had a bolt-sized pin go through 2 bulletproof windows with a person sitting between them. A bulldozer was pulling a pin out of a worn-out tooth on the bucket of a rope shovel. It suddenly went and had enough energy it went through the windshield and back window of the dozer with the operator sitting there. Both were supposedly strong enough to stop bullets because of all the flying rocks and stuff. I think I'm misremembering. I never heard of what happened to the operator, so I don't think it hit a dozer with someone in it. I think for safety reasons, they didn't pull in line, but had a pulley attached to a second dozer, so if this happened, it wouldn't hurt anyone. Story 56. Not OSHA inspector, but free climbing up 3 levels, 20 feet, of warehouse racking. A hidden lounge set up on the 2nd level of warehouse racking for people to chill and nap, big enough for 2 people. Actually, cool and a bit funny. I could not even begin to list how many forklift safety violations I've seen. 10-plus year light manufacturing company had zero process for reporting worker injuries. Guys there told me stories about all the injuries over the years. Lots of substances abused during work without supervisors taking action. A fully operational warehouse disty center of 100-plus people that used extension cords exclusively. They were all over the floor, maybe 100 total. X cords should be temporary and not perm fastened. Story 57. Not an OSHA inspector, but the stories in this thread are reminding me of the time I stopped for a cup of chai at a roadside cafe in Pakistan, and the guy said he just had to turn the electric on. He then took out 2 large iron hooks connected to cables, and one at a time swung them around his head, and then threw them onto the electric cable running along poles down the side of the road. The second one landed clattering on the cable in a shower of sparks, and then all his lights came on. Story 58. I'm not an inspector, but dealt with them. Used to work in a body shop, and we helped clear dangerous accidents that the state needed off the road and taken care of in a very limited set amount of time. These accidents involved shootings or DOE victims. We were having an inspection that day. A new car came in, and we always move those cars to a very particular lot, so law informant knows where it is. Well, when that gate was opening, the inspector got a glimpse inside and saw a partial hand. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Don't worry, it's not any of our employees." He was not amused. Story 59. Not an OSHA inspector, but I worked for a very large e-commerce store at the time. For a week, I was tasked with filling in at the warehouse because they needed some assistance. Over the course of a few days, I had multiple very close calls due to poor safety protocols. The most notable to me was carrying a large box on my shoulder up a 20-plus foot ladder to the 3rd or 4th level of a sorting rack. I had no harnesses or ropes of any kind. The ladder was the kind that connects at the middle and was very flimsy. I quit that day. Story 60. My brother was a safety inspector in a plant. He saw a guy wearing gloves on a milling machine and told him to stop. The guy filed a grievance with the union, and a few days later had most of his fingers on one hand ripped off. You never wear gloves around rotating machinery. Better to get a cut than have your fingers, hand, or arm ripped off. Story 61. I worked at a chicken processing plant for a few years. Not processing chicken, thankfully. The guys who work with the heavy equipment had just finished their OSHA training when one of the gits who thought he knew better went back to the chicken grinder to show everyone that the safety guy was an idiot. He then proceeded to show how he clears the machine the wrong way, and it's totally safe. Yeah, so he lost an arm that day. Story 62. Without giving out too many details, was sent out to investigate after an incident involving a specific piece of equipment being left in a condition that was a causal factor in someone winding up in the ICU, at a location that had already had several other kinds of OSHA violations and near misses. My agency stepped up its frequency of inspections considerably, went back to the site less than a month after the severe injury incident to find another of the same type of equipment left sitting in the same condition that led to that incident. Story 63. Had guys doing an asbestos removal project for me as the PM. Full decontamination, positive pressure face masks, air monitoring, the lot. Briefed the guys, full RAMs, etc. 5-day job, so went to site on Wednesday to do a safety audit to find 2 of the boys outside the enclosure refusing to go in. The supervisor, an experienced guy, was running around with a crowbar, smashing the asbestos ceiling to bits. Asbestos dust everywhere. Absolutely mental scenes. Story 64. Not an OSHA guy, but a volunteer firefighter. We had an OSHA inspector pass away in my town one morning because a piece of heavy machinery rolled over and crushed him in a porta-john. The construction workers only pinned him to the earth at first. They tried to pick it up with a back escort and dropped it on him again, which killed him. Story 65. Not an OSHA inspector, but sit on the employee safety committee. Had a guy stripping paint with a pressure washer on a rig to inspect the pipe. Got flecks of paint on his face shield and decided that instead of stopping to wipe it off, he would use the pressure washer to clean his face shield while wearing it. Needless to say, the outcome was not pretty. Story 66. I'm not an OSHA guy, and I don't know for sure if this is even OSHA's jurisdiction, but I saw a construction worker sitting in the shovel of an excavator. Anyways, just one of those machines with the arm and a big shovel at the end, and he was welding from it with wires dangling down and everything. I think it was welding because there was sparks and crap. At least he had his helmet and Oakley's on right. Story 67. Not an OSHA inspector, but I once checked the emergency stop buttons in a big chemical plant. While most of them were fine, there was one room where you had to press all of them to trigger a shutdown. There were 5 buttons in a 10M long room. The operators were shocked to hear this, and we got it fixed before the plant went back into production. Story 68. Not an OSHA inspector, but I was on a safety committee in a concrete plant back in 2002-ish. Saw dudes welding near oily rags, started a small fire. One time this guy was welding in standing water. Seemed a little dangerous to me. Craziest thing was a forklift tire blowing out a tire. Sounded like a bomb went off. Saw a 3-sided precast bridge fail while being stripped from a form. Kind of crazy when 5 tons of concrete and steel come crashing down. Story 69. Not an OSHA inspector, but was Site A's for renewables projects. I found multiple contractors standing on top of wind turbines on the nose cone, hub, not wearing any harnesses. Even saw one woman who must have been getting some artsy Instapics because she was only in her underwear and topless. Instantly fired every one of them off our sites in May. Story 70. Working in West Texas oil and gas pipeline. Boss man asked the shortest person in the crew, maybe 5 feet tall, to walk the 8-10-foot deep trench front to back, throwing out big rocks that might scratch the pipe when being lowered onto the sandbags. I saw a ladder in the middle of the trench sticking up with zero shoring and rocks coming out of nowhere in the trench from being thrown. 2 people went home without pay that day. Story 71. Obligatory, not an inspector, but hoo boy, do I have some stories. My favorite is going to a factory for the first time and seeing one of the little old Mexican lady operators come in the morning and put her lunch bag into a barrel located by her workstation so she wouldn't have to go back to the lunchroom to get her lunch. You know what else was in that barrel? Asbestos. She'd been doing that for years. Story 72. It was one job that had several different ones going on at one time. A rainy day had about a dozen or so roofers not tied off. No steel plates over open excavations under the road, again during the rain. Diesel generators being run in ventilated garages, what with the rain and all that they were finishing. And out back was a massive unbraced trench where 3 different guys were in literally over their heads. I couldn't exactly call for backup. Story 73. A fire door exit on the 2nd level of a building which went into thin air. They had removed the exit stairs but had not decommissioned the fire exit. Never forget opening that door and looking down, imagining the pile of employees on the ground below. Story 74. And you had a chemical fire at a facility that recycles drums and containers. Show up to do an investigation on the cause. Dude told me he would mix residuals from containers based on color and smell, but that recently his smelling wasn't so good and he's colorblind. Scary thing is that there are tons of places like that all over. Story 75. Not an inspector, but when I worked as a lab tech, I had a student check if their Bunsen burner was on by putting their hand over where the flame would be. It wasn't on. This was when they were using the blue flame, which can't always be seen. So it was very much a chance that their Bunsen was on, and I aged several decades in that moment. Story 76. Went to check up on a pharmacy that was having power issues since this one appliance wasn't turning on. Checked the breakers. All on. Go back to the appliance to see if it's connected to a separate panel and found a commercially available unit transformer was what it was plugged into, which, upon tracing, we found out it was hardwired into another panel. Story 77. My coworker once duct taped 2 ladders together to reach the top shelf in the warehouse as the forklift was out of order. When he got to the top of the bottom ladder, the tape snapped and he fell 4M, 12 to 13 feet, and landed on his side and smacked his head. Miraculously, he was perfectly fine. Not even a scratch on him. We had him go see a doctor just in case he had a concussion. He didn't. Story 78. My sister was a lawyer for the Department of Labor and did a lot of work with OSHA. One story she told me was about a painting contractor in Pittsburgh who got the contract to paint the 3 bridges. They used no safety equipment and just hung the painters out there with rope. I believe the contractor went to jail. Story 79. I was working on a non-union high-rise and a dude cut off a finger with a circular saw. He bandaged it up and showed up to work the next day. They gave him a raise and the title of safety officer. I quit a week after a 2A4 fell off the 18th floor and landed a few feet away from me. Story 80. I'm not an inspector, but I answer to OSHA and keep my guys safe. I fired a guy for trying to drive a scissor lift downstairs, like actual stairs. Story 81. Not OSHA, but I work at a middle school and every day without fail, someone tries to drink from the eye wash station in the shop. There's even a big sign that says, "Don't drink from the eye wash station," hung above, you guessed it, the eye wash station. So it's like potentially risk your vision or get blasted in the eyeball with middle schooler spit. Story 82. Not an OSHA inspector, but I feel this might be relevant after reading some other comments. Forklift safety trainer was coming to the warehouse so the guys could get up to date with training, etc. Trainer drove his truck straight into the building when he arrived. Still taught the class. Everyone laughed about it for weeks. Story 83. A minor one. But we had a health and safety guy go around our office a few years ago. Biggest issue he found was the fire warden hanging his high-vis jacket off his monitor, creating a fire risk.